I will mitten. My name is Carrie, the host of this podcast, coming to you from the middle of the Mitten, Michigan's Lower Peninsula, where my husband and I have a small farm with a small flock of sheep, two horses, two chickens, an elderly barn cat, a big woods, and a small cabin on the other side of that woods. Thank you for joining in today. I have filmed the episode of the podcast and have it all put together, but it's in bits and pieces. And I thought maybe a little introduction was in order to make it a little bit more cohesive, to tell you what was going to be happening in it and to tell you about a few other things. So the title of the episode is A Sweater's Quantity. And in there, I had hoped to talk about what it might take to go from a year's worth of fleece to roving, to taking it to a mill to be processed into roving, or to be spun into yarn to make a sweater, or taking it to a mill to have yarn made to make a sweater. So just a few fun facts and a few ideas about what can happen to do that. Along with that, I am participating in Hand Spun Winter, a knit along, make along, spin along with Emily of Fibertown. And Fibertown is Fibre town. And I wanted to mention, I've talked about Emily before, but she's one of my spinning and knitting and sweater making wool heroes. She processes a lot of fleece from start to finish and spins a lot of yarn and makes a lot of sweaters from those. So I find that really enjoyable, and she's my idol when it comes to that. So hopefully one day I can make as many sweaters from start to finish as she has. As a sheep producer, as a wool producer, I should be able to, shouldn't I? So you might want to check that out. That's going through till spring, and just a low pressure, low key spin along that we can talk about and share about fibers and maybe our processes. So be sure and check that out. And so that ties in with this sweaters quantity episode that I'm doing. The other one is Marley's, my friend Marley's, who has Yarn Brew podcast, and I'm going to talk about her later on. But her make along is a meaningful one, and she's one of the most meaningful makers that I know. And so the two of those things together, I hope there's a little bit of a theme to that in this podcast going forward. When it comes to bucket talk, when we talk about the sheep and when you get to visit with the sheep this month, I had intended to talk about fences, a boring topic maybe, but a very important one if you're raising livestock or considering it. But an incident arose here on the farm this last week, and while it was fresh in my mind, I thought I would like to talk to you about it. And it may be uncomfortable for some people, so if you want to skip over that portion, you can. I'll try to put timestamps down below so you can just skip to the spinning and knitting content. But you might want to watch it. There are no bloody, cruel, graphic images. It's just talking about what can happen when you raise sheep especially, but any livestock, whether you're raising them as pets or to solely produce fiber, or whether you're raising them as breeding stock or even for meat. A time is going to come, they're living, breathing creatures, and there's going to be times that arise when you have to decide what to do, whether you want to or whether you don't. If an animal can no longer live on your farm or with you, what you're going to do, how you're going to handle that. Are you emotionally able to, physically able to? So I'm just going to talk about that a little bit. And even if you aren't raising animals, if you're buying fleece or yarn to support a small farmer, you may want to look at that, because it's just another thing to think about that's involved in producing that product that you might enjoy. So that's going to be the first thing, and then we'll move into talking about spinning and knitting and sweaters. I'm going to talk in detail about this sweater like I said I would, and then finish up the podcast. Now, I did want to talk in this podcast about what can happen when you send fiber out to be made into yarn, when you send it out to be spun into yarn. It doesn't always come out as you had anticipated. And so I want to show you a few examples of that and talk about that, and talk about how you have to be prepared as a producer to financially handle that, deal with that, and then talk a little bit about what we're going to do on this farm going forward as far as yarn production. So this was getting to be pretty long, and so I think I'm going to put that bit about the yarns out in a separate little side video here later this month, and maybe you can watch that then. This was getting long, one of my longest ones yet, It's December, the middle of December. We're all busy. There are a lot of neat vlogmases out right now that we're all watching. So I didn't want to cram everything together and have a video that's over an hour long. You don't have time for that, and I don't have time for that. So that will be a little bit later, even though it will go along with this. So I've rambled on long enough. I hope you'll stay with me to watch the rest of the podcast. This is our full episode number 3. And again, I think I say it in the podcast, but I appreciate all of you for signing up and following along and for your feedback and what you have to say to me. I really appreciate that. If you haven't already liked and subscribed, you can do that down below. And if you don't want to miss anything that we put out, just hit the little bell that's next to the subscription. And that way you get a notification whenever I put anything out, whether it's 5 minutes or 20 minutes or an hour long. So again, thank you. And I hope you're having a wonderful weekend. And I hope you're having a wonderful December. And I look forward to hearing what you think about this episode, A Sweater's Quantity, from Serenity Farms in the middle of the Mitten. Oh, and sitting here, I'm surrounded by beautiful wool from Sweden that I'm spinning as part of the hand-spun winter spin along. It's just glorious, and it smells so good. So find some fiber to hug or spin or knit and settle in and watch today's podcast episode. And then there were 2. Morning, chickens. Big happenings in the night, huh? And off they go. There's feed everywhere. It's just habit to holler. Yeah, we need some fresh straw this morning, don't we? Huh? What do you think about this nice sunny day? Hi, Hannah. Good morning and welcome to this month's episode of Bucket Talk. Our talk from down in the barn with the sheep and the chickens with us here today. It's a nice sunny bright day, but it's crisp and it's cold. You can see my breath probably. And I tried to find the best spot to sit where you could see me and the sheep, but unfortunately I think all you can see are sheep butts at the feeder back here. I'm looking forward at sheep faces. Maybe I'll turn the camera around after a bit so you can see them too. But I'm getting ready to finish up the podcast, and I had mentioned something on Instagram the other day about the unfortunate and the unpleasant things that have to be done on the farm. When I started this podcast out, one of the things that I mentioned to you all and that you all seemed interested in was that I wanted to talk about maybe some of the old ways of farming, what it takes to be a farmer or a livestock producer, at least our experiences with it. And I had kind of a plan in mind of what I wanted to do. One of the things we get asked the most, my husband and myself, or if we attend a conference, we don't do that much anymore, but it seems like the things that people would ask the most are, what do you need to get started with sheep or with livestock? And also when I watch blogs or podcasts or video, Instagram feeds of people who are starting out, I look at the direction that they go sometimes if they don't have a mentor, and quite often it's things round backwards. So I thought maybe I would give some tips and the things that I thought about. The thing that I had intended to talk about first And the thing that I think is the most important is fences. Before the livestock, before you choose a place to purchase, or before you decide to bring something into your homestead, your farm, your city lot, is fences. But a situation arose this week that gave me a chance to think about something else that I did want to talk about in a future episode, and I thought I might as well do it right now while it's still fresh in my mind, right after it's happened. And so this is going to be something fairly real about what happens sometimes when you raise livestock on a farm, what should happen. And so I just want to warn you about that if you don't want to watch it. There's not going to be any graphic pictures. You probably know by now that I'm talking about, I'm not talking about death actually, I'm talking about culling or making a decision to sell. And so no bloody graphics, no awful pictures, no pictures of a lamb chop on the plate after butchering. But if you're thinking at all about having sheep and livestock, or if you think about supporting a farmer or a livestock producer or a fiber producer, and part of your decision is based on how that person raises their animals, you might want to listen to this. I promise it's not that unpleasant. It's more from a personal perspective. So, how this pertains to somebody who's maybe getting started with livestock is that you need to ask yourself, do you want to be a pet? Do you want to raise pets? Do you want to be a pet producer, a pet farm? Or do you want to raise livestock for yourself, or maybe to earn a little income on your farm? So you have to think about that. Because if you just are going into this to be raising pets, you still can do that, and you can still earn money with fiber, and you can still produce your own fiber. But you still have to think about that the day comes that these are living, breathing creatures, and the day comes when they can't live and breathe anymore, or possibly you can't have them anymore. So you have to have a plan in place for that. You have to think about what that entails, how that happens, what you need to have that happen, and whether you can do it. If you can't bring yourself to ever part with an animal, if you can't bring yourself to ever sell off something that you've raised, whether it be for economic reasons, for food reasons, or just because you can't do it anymore, you still need to think about those things. It happens. So I'm not going to talk about illness and death today. I'm going to talk about what happens when it doesn't work out for an animal to stay on your farm. So some of the things that you might want to think about in that is, how will you sell an animal that you can no longer keep or that you no longer want to keep? We'd like to all think it could be a nice happy sale to another happy farm, but that doesn't always happen. It can't always happen, or maybe you don't have time for it to happen. So maybe you're looking at a location where your farm is going to be, or where your farm or home is at. There aren't that many stockyards anymore, places that you can take an animal on a monthly or a weekly basis to sell. But if you can find one near you at all, or if you can think about how often you might have to travel to one, think about the distance. I had a dear friend who raised a beautiful flock of sheep over in the thumb of Michigan, and their livestock market closed, and then the closest one to her was nearly 4 hours away. So you have to think about, how do you load an animal, how do you get it there, and what it costs you to get there. You know, that affects your bottom dollar. Where we live, we're about 5 miles, between 5 and 10 miles, 5, closer to 5, from a fairly big stockyards that does take sheep on consignment sale once a month. And so that's a good thing for us. Now, I will stop as an aside and say that up until a few months ago, we were fortunate enough to have a butcher shop less than a mile from us, about a quarter of a mile from us. And if we had a lamb that wasn't going to go to market, or even an older sheep, we could have it butchered without it ever leaving the farm. He would come here, the sheep would be busy eating grain in a feeder on their own farm, and that's when their life ended. And that was a pretty humane and respectful way for them to go. Anyway, that's an aside. That butcher shop burned down and we don't have it anymore. So I'm rambling on about this to say that earlier this week, well, for the last couple of weeks, I've been having some issues with a couple of the sheep that I kept. If you've watched my podcast, you know that we sold off the majority of our flock a little while ago. But there were a few that I kept that I wasn't sure about, but I'd committed to them and we'd see what might happen. One of those was a ram lamb that I bought for breeding stock. One was a ewe lamb that I kept to be future breeding stock, and one was a couple years older sheep that wasn't born here, came in from another farm. Anyway, those three were my three problem ones for various reasons. And I had never intended to keep the Border Leicester on after breeding season, but I thought I'd keep him, I'd get ewes bred to him, we'd shear him and I'd have his fleece, and then we would send him off to wherever he was going to go. Well, I started to get a little suspicious. It just didn't seem like he had a lot of interest in his ewes, unlike my little Corriedale, who was doing his job very well. This time of year is breeding season for us, so the rams were in. Now, ram lambs, and I say lambs, they're not quite a year old yet. You know, sometimes it might take them a little while to get their ewes settled, but neither one of them had very many. The Border Leicester had 4 or 5. At his age, he was born in February of this year, so he was coming up on his, he would have been turning a year old in February. And he should have been able to settle some ewes. Just didn't seem like he was getting the job done. So I made the decision. We usually pull the rams out the first of the year, then whoever's bred or whoever isn't. Anyway, I put all of the ewes in with the Corriedale lamb, because he seemed to be doing a good job. Now, he's quite a bit younger. He was born end of April, 1st of May. But he was doing, and he was acting like a ram should. I was happy with that. So I put all the ewes together, and he immediately bred 2 of the ewes that had been in with the Border Leicester. Another day passed, and he bred a 3rd ewe that had been in with the Border Leicester. So that tells me the Border Leicester wasn't getting his job done. Now, I could have kept him as a companion to the other sheep who I had made up my mind was probably going to go, but I've mentioned in another part of the podcast that the Border Leicester was a jumper. Not after ewes, obviously, but he could leap a fence, and he did. So he was out a lot. That creates problems. So it was just a matter of time before he was going to go, but I would have sheared them first and at least got the money for the fleece. The other sheep, that was the 3-year-old sheep that was giving me trouble, had been fighting with a few of the ewes. And at breeding time, well, any time, they don't need that extra stress. And he was getting a little bit more obnoxious about it. Well, Monday morning I came down, and he had a sheep down. And I thought he had maybe broke a leg or broke a neck on one. This is the weather. And he hadn't. Fortunately, that sheep was all right. Hi, sweetie. Chickens are here pecking at my shirt. Tuesday would have been our stockyards day. We didn't have snow on the ground, and it wasn't muddy. So I could sit and think, well, maybe I can keep them till shearing time and get the fleece. But hay is short this year. And if I kept them, they would have had to be in a separate place, so that would have meant separate water, separate cleaning for me, worrying about the fence for the Border Leicester to get in and out. We no longer have a truck and trailer, but we have somebody who hauls livestock. So I made the call and made the arrangements, and Tuesday morning, those 3 sheep left out of here. So that is a hard decision to make. I don't make it lightly. If the butcher shop would have still been here, that would have been meat in our freezer. But we don't have that anymore. And so this way I have a little bit of money to help pay for the last bit of hay that we bought. The barn is peaceful and quiet again, and it's over and done. But it is a difficult decision, and it's not an easy one to make. It's one of the things I miss the most about not having my husband healthy and on 2 legs and able to do farming. Now, maybe that's not fair to him, but he was always the one who loaded up the animals and took them off if they needed to be. I didn't have to be, I mean, it still happened, and I knew it did, and I had to make the decisions, but I didn't have to be in the barn or trailer them over. That's one of the hardest things for me, but we do it. because this is a farm. We're not raising pets. We're raising livestock. I have to make a little bit of money, or at least they have to pay for themselves. And I have to be able to do my job in the barn. And those guys weren't living up to their part of it. They weren't doing what they should have done. So they're gone. So see, I told you, no blood and guts, but something that you have to think about. Could you do that? Do you have a livestock market or a butcher shop close by where you could send those animals if you needed to? And when I feel whether you're raising livestock or whether you're keeping pets, it's a two-way street. You've got your part to do and they've got theirs. So an animal that's just doing what instinct tells it to do is one thing. Like if that Border Leicester lamb was jumping out to get in with ewes to breed them, I would say good. Well, I wouldn't say good, I'd still be mad, but I would say he's just doing what nature intended for him to do. But he wasn't. He wasn't settling ewes, getting them bred. So he was getting a free meal. What do you think, Sushi? No problems with you, huh? Or you, Ninja? And oddly enough, it was the Finn ewes that weren't getting bred. The Cordale did. He's gone through everybody and he's making a second pass checking them now. So I'll probably leave him in for a while. Uh-oh, a burr. Did that come from the hay? Oh, sorry, sidetracked. So that's my little bit of bucket talk, farm talk today. If you don't agree with those practices, if you would want to keep everything, and we do have a couple of older sheep, some of our first sheep, that don't leave here. When their time comes, we can put them down and they can be buried out here. And we have a few that are. Some of them have earned that right and earned that place here on the farm. When Francie's time comes, I'm looking at Hannah. When her time comes, a few of these old girls, they'll be here on the farm. But others, young ones, medium age ones that aren't living up to their part of the deal, then they need to go. There was a time, or if it were summertime, I may have advertised and seen if I could have sold them. But even then, you don't know what kind of home they're going to go to. And isn't it just as stressful for them to leave a place they know and go to another farm, at least for a time? We're also very lucky that the livestock yards that we have close to us, the man who works there that handles, takes the animals in and has worked there for a really long time, is a super, super guy with the animals. The stockyards near where I grew up as a kid was awful. The people that worked there were mean, I thought. But this guy, he talks to them just like we do, makes sure they have food and water till their time comes, and is just really respectful of them. So I don't know what I'm going to do when he ever retires or leaves the job. But anyway, that was the thing I wanted to talk about today. It's a real part of farming. It's a real part of raising livestock. It's one option that you have. And like I said, even if you choose to have these animals as pets, if you're not breeding them, you're not worried about making money by selling lamb for somebody's table, or you're not going to eat them yourselves, you still have to have a plan in place for what you do if the unthinkable to you happens, if somebody gets sick, if somebody dies, what you're going to do about that. So those are my thoughts for today. And just so you know, in case you want to unfollow me, we do sell animals off for that reason. Well, anyway, enough cheerful, sad talk, but still real parts of farming. You can tell me what you think if you like, or if this is something you've thought about, or what your answer to it is. But it's part of the economics of it. If this stockyard's over here closed, I think the closest one I would have after that is nearly an hour and a half away. So that means a different way for you to think and plan for. You have to pay a trucker if you hire someone to come and haul for you, even if you don't have your own and you're not buying the gas, you're paying somebody. You're just a little peach. I gotta get somebody to help me take some pictures of your fleece to show the people. And behind her, probably, I don't think you can quite see him, right over here, is the little ram lamb who's doing a great job. You know, that's another thing to be said about animals, bloodlines, that you've raised and nurtured for a lot of years. You know what to expect. You know what's going to happen. He's doing just what I expected him to do. This older bloodline of Corriedales that we have, well, don't eat so fast, are very early breeders and very sure breeders. So I'm figuring he's probably got everybody settled. So I still should have lambs in a fairly close window of time. And I think I'll just let him stay with the ewes for a while. Because I don't have a partner to keep him with, we always kept 2 rams, or a ram and a wether, partly to have different bloodlines to offer to sell to people or to breed ourselves, but also so they had company on the off season. And now he doesn't have a buddy to stay with, so I'll let him run with the ewes for a while. He's very... Well, you gotta slow down and not eat so fast, honey. He's quite the gentleman, so not too worried about that. Well, anyway, now it's time to go up to the house and pay some bills and hopefully finish up the podcast today. I hope this hasn't gotten too long, and I hope some of it made sense. And I hope it wasn't too unpleasant for you. But it is part of being a farmer, livestock producer. There's just no way around it, no matter what you keep them for. I hope you're enjoying your day wherever you are. What do you think, Sush? Today on this episode of the My Wool Mitten podcast, wait, there's a package, and I think it might be from Sweden. I'll be right back. It is. It's a package all the way from Sweden. How timely is that, guys? So maybe I can open it. I can be one of those people who opens packages on their podcast to show you. But what I started to say is that on this episode of the My Wool Mitten podcast, we're going to be talking about a sweater's quantity. And my thinking behind that is growing a sweater's quantity of wool, or having it processed, or spinning it into yarn, or purchasing yarn. So I have here on the table, before I sit down and start spinning, oh, and look, you guys can see some of our ugly orange carpet. That's a whole nother story for another day. But so what we would do is start with the sheep, of course. Next would come, after shearing, the raw wool. And of course, this is nowhere near a sweater's quantity. This isn't a full fleece. It's just a little sample. See if I can get a close-up of these delicious locks. This was a coated fleece, so it's really clean. Look at that. So then we would have our wool. And let's say that it's approximately, this is a lamb fleece, so between 5 and 8 pounds off of the lamb. It's a coated fleece, so there's not going to be a lot of loss. But we do skirt away what isn't covered by the fleece or any felted bits. Of course, the manure or the wet bits. And then whether we keep it for ourselves or whether we send it to the mill with a fine wool fleece and heavy in the lanolin, we're probably going to lose maybe as much as half. We figure on at least a third, but when it's a really greasy fleece, one with a lot of lanolin, it can be as much as half. So then if I've sent it to be processed into roving, then it's going to come back and there's going to be however many pounds of roving. And then I have to decide how much of that I need to spin. and what weight I want it to be, and then how much is that going to take to have enough yarn to make a sweater. So those were my props for today, and I'm still tickled that the Swedish wool came at the same time. Those are my props for today, and now I'm going to sit down and we're going to talk numbers, weight, yards, ounces, time, and talk about spinning for a sweater. So I hope you'll join me today. I am back at this. Fingers crossed that we can get a little bit more recorded today. Interruption after interruption. How do people make podcasts? Doesn't matter what I'm doing, there's some interruption. I just got all sat down here again after 2 or 3 interruptions, and the phone rang. And then after I finished with the phone, then my husband needed some things. So he's resting now, and hopefully you can't hear the TV. I can hear it. Hopefully it won't be too bad. And the light, I apologize, it's probably going to go in and out, but it's probably the best we're going to get for a while, and I want to get this recorded. So I started out by showing you some of the props I had with the raw wool, with the roving, and with the spun yarn. And because the focus of this episode is a sweater's quantity, I wanted to talk a little bit. One of the things we get asked a lot if someone is especially a new spinner, if they're going to spin their own yarn to knit something, how much do I need for a sweater? Well, of course, that's going to depend on how you knit, what weight of yarn you're going to be using, how you spin. So all of those things. But I thought I'd just give you an example of a recent test spin that I've been doing. I took notes, and I'm going to have to probably refer to them and read them because I won't remember it otherwise. But spinning a thicker yarn like an Aran weight, a chunky weight, to make another colorwork type sweater, just to see how much I was going to need, and just out of curiosity how long that was going to take me to do it. And so I just took some notes as I did it. So I'm going to read those off a little bit as I go. But the other thing I thought I would mention to you, I mentioned a little bit in the introduction to this, is about the weight of a yarn, of a fleece when we shear a sheep and after we skirt it, and what that weight is going to the mill. So because for this example, let's say that I'm sending that fleece to the mill to be made into roving or a bat, but something to spin with, and what will come back. And I showed you some examples of a brown fleece, but I know, just because it's fresh in my memory, the last white fleece that I sent 10 pounds, 10.5 pounds of raw wool, and it came back as 8.5 pounds of roving. Am I saying that right? I'll double check that. But it was Hannah's fleece that I mentioned the last time, which is, by the way, now all sold out. And so thank you to everyone who purchased some. But anyway, just to know that then when we skirt that fleece and with what we send in, we could lose a third. We could lose up to half with a fine wool and with a sheep that has a lot of lanolin, what we call heavy in the grease, because when you wash, most of that's going to come out. So then let's say we get back that big bag of roving, and people are often really surprised to see just how big a bag of roving is when it comes back from the mill. And I don't have a full bag. Maybe I can look through my phone and see if I've got some pictures somewhere to show you. But so then you look at that. And in my case, I thought about the yarn that I wanted to spin. So I pulled out a few ounces to sample on my spinning wheel to get the yarn that I wanted and to measure and see how much I'd need to spin. So what I like to do is take out approximately 2 ounces, split that in half. So I've got 2 little 1 ounce bats or pieces of roving, and spin an ounce of singles onto each bobbin of my wheel, whichever wheel I'm using. So and in this case, I'm looking for a 2-ply yarn for the sweater that I want to make. So I spun an ounce on one bobbin, I spun an ounce on a second bobbin. So, a total of 2 ounces. Then I did take a note. It took me about half an hour to spin each ounce. That was sitting down and spinning straight through. Now, sometimes I might get to spin for 2 minutes, 5 minutes, half an hour. But when I sat down and dedicated myself to spinning 1 full ounce, it took me half an hour. I always let my bobbins rest overnight or for a few hours. I never ply them right away. I don't know, that's how I learned, and I don't know if you need to do that or not. You probably don't, but that's what I still to this day do. Oh, the hair, excuse it. So I let it rest, and then I come back in the morning to ply it. And this took me 10 to 12 minutes to ply, to take those two 1-ounce bobbins, ply them together into a 2-ply. That took me 10 to 12 minutes. And then again, I let that rest. After that, I wound it off on my nitty knotty. I have a nitty knotty that measures exactly 2 yards that my grandpa made for me. And so it's a special handmade instrument or tool that I use. And he was he had looked at several commercially made ones, and they were like 1 3/4 ounce, but he got it so it's exactly 2 yards, not ounces. So 2 yards, wound that off, and this was only 72 yards in that 2 ounces of Aran weight 2-ply, 72 yards, so fairly thick. So that would mean in 4 ounces of fiber, I'd have approximately 150 yards, close to that. For the sweater that I'm looking at making, for my size, I need about 895 yards. That's the estimate. I'm a loose knitter, so we'll see. That could be more, but I've got plenty if I need to spin more. So I was just figuring that if I needed 895 yards, I'd need 12.5 plied bobbins, 12.5 bobbins of 72 yards. That means that I've got to spin 24, 25, 1 ounce, if I were just going to spin them at 1 ounces at a time, my singles, to then, put back together. Of course, the Louette has really big bobbins. I can spin 2 ounces on there, so that's what I could do. But let's say that I did that all in half-hour, 1 ounce increments to then ply back together. That means that I'm going to need a little over 12 hours to spin the singles, the 1 ounces onto the bobbins, and another approximately 2 hours of total plying time to put everything together. And that's going to take me about 1.5 pounds of roving. That probably doesn't, that's just me doing figures, but just to give you a rough idea of what you're looking at. I'd always want to have extra. I'd always want to have, so for this amount, if I'm figuring it, that's probably about 1.5 pounds, I'd probably want to have at least 2 pounds. Because I'm going to have some sampling, there's going to be some slubs or some pieces I need to pull out. So say 2.5 pounds just to be sure. And that's to make a pretty thick yarn. Kind of like what I had showed on the table here, which is sitting over there outside. Pick it up and show you. But so I thought that might be interesting to you. And of course it's going to be a lot different if you're spinning fingering weight or a sport weight. But I just like looking at that. It actually wasn't as much time as what I thought it was going to be, partly because it's a thicker yarn. So anyway, do you find that interesting? I thought it was kind of fun to think about that that's what it was going to be. And I am spinning right now for Handspun Winter with Emily at Fibertown. That's going through till after the first of the year. And that's kind of a fun thing just to know that other people are spinning for a project. And the brown yarn and wool that I showed you in the little clip leading into this is not what I'm spinning for that. I'm spinning some of the Swedish wool from Caroline and Knut that I talked about. And I'm spinning that I'm trying to spin it all as a single to put together into a project along with some of our Corriedale roving. So we'll see. It's not spinning up just at the weight that I want, so I'm playing around a little bit. And the package that I got interrupted with, which was from Sweden, was some more of their roving that I ordered. So I'm kind of excited about that, and I'll show you some pictures of that after a bit. So that's my talk about spinning for a sweater, at a sweater's quantity. And so I just wonder if any of you who have spun for a sweater before, if this is what you find, is that how you weigh things out to try? What's your method of spinning for a sweater, or any project, but talking about a sweater now. So I'm just curious, and maybe this gives you some ideas to look at going forward if you were doing it for yourself. So I'm going to pause here for a minute and see how this is looking, and then we'll come back and we'll talk some more about a sweater's quantity. Okay, I'm back. It looks like this is recording okay, other than I am in a lot of shadow, but it's the best we can do for right now, so we're going to press forward. Some more I wanted to say about that spinning for the sweater. First, I wanted to show you, let's see if I can get that. This is the yarn, the brown yarn that I spun. I think you can see how thick it is. And that's a 2-ply. So I just thought I'd show you up close. And I also want to say that I'm not usually that methodical about anything that I do, spinning or knitting. I usually just sit down and start doing it with no thought and no plan. I spin for joy. I don't worry about grist or twist or angle, or I just spin because I love it, because I love the fiber, and then I usually decide what I'm going to make after I spin. But this was some that I thought, people ask a lot, and so I thought it might be something interesting for the podcast. I know some people are very technical about their spins, but I'm not. So I didn't want you to think that I was. That was just something that was interesting me for a change. And so that's what I did, and that's what I took notes to do. And with the Swedish wool, because I only have a certain amount of it, I'm being a little more careful about how I'm spinning it, so that I don't run out. I will blend it with some of our Corriedale. That will stretch it. And so I can do that. Excuse me. But I am being a little bit more conscious of how much I have to spin for that. Another thing I thought that you might find interesting, I mentioned how many pounds of raw wool we could send and what we might expect to get back as roving. And like I said, then a big, huge bag of nice, fluffy roving comes back. Contrast that to how much can come and go when we're having yarn made at the mill. The last yarn that I sent and got back, we sent approximately 22 pounds of raw fleece to be made into yarn. Then it's washed and carded and picked and then spun into yarn. And this was spun into a 3-ply sport weight. But of that 22 pounds, we got back 12 pounds and 6 ounces in yarn. And that's fairly typical. And so I just thought maybe you would be interested to know how much more loss there is. And I'm not sure why, if it's because it goes through the carder. I don't know. But that seems to be pretty typical and no matter what mill I've used. There's about 3 main mills that I've used over the years, and that seems to be. The one difference to that, you'll see in the little clip that I've included today about yarns that we've had spun and sometimes when it hasn't turned out just the way that I've wanted it to. This last bunch that I had done working with a new mill, and she's learning and I'm learning with her, but there was a lot more loss than that. So, and that equals money for me and for them. So anyway, that's something to think about too. If you're thinking about buying a fleece and having it turned into yarn, or if you're a new producer of, raising your own sheep and you're thinking about spending some wool to be made into yarn, that there can be a lot of loss. So that's something else to think about that I wanted to share with you. So, all right, I guess that's all I wanted to say about that. Now maybe I can talk about, I told you I would give you some more detail about my Tensho sweater that I didn't last time, some of the modifications that I did to the construction of it, and the yarn that I did use for it. So I think that I'll pause and get a cup of coffee and come back and we'll talk about that a little bit. So I hope you'll stay with me. Oh, I can't get my full length in, but I thought I'd stand up and show you the top. And then I'll talk about the sweater a little bit, and then maybe I'll take it off and either put it on the mannequin or lay it on the table. I'd had it folded up, so I got a little bit of wrinkles there. But so this is the Tensho pullover, and I've got a ratty old turtleneck on underneath, but I've talked about this sweater several times. I'm going to try to sit down without knocking over the camera. Might have to pause and get reset up here. Just let you gaze on this beautiful yoke again, and I'll get set down and we'll talk about this some more. Okay, let's see if we can talk some more about the tencho sweater, the tencho pullover. This was designed as a bottom-up sweater. It was intended to have color work at the yoke, at the cuffs, and at the hem. And I knew that I wasn't going to do the color work at the hem, not just because that's my widest part, but also because I didn't have a excess quantity of the Irenia, am I saying that right, Caroline, yarn, and so I wanted to be sure I had plenty, and I was pretty sure that I did, but I thought if I do have extra, I'd rather make either a cowl or headband or mitts or something. So anyway, I decided I wanted to leave that off. I worked this from the top down instead of bottom up. Did some short row shaping at the back. Worked my way down. I did a little bit of increases to make it more of like an A-line because, like I said, my bottom half, my hips and my belly are my widest part. Made it a little bit longer. I did a split hem, also split length, so it's a little bit longer in the back than it is in the front. I did the I-cord for the start, for the neck up here. And if you look, or every once in a while you might actually catch a glimpse, there's still a thread there and it's still not closed up. I'm not sure if I want to do a little bit more, if I want to come up a little bit higher. I like the wide neck. I nearly always wear a turtleneck in the winter or something underneath, so that's okay. But it could be just a few rows higher. And so I could easily pick that out and unravel it, pick up again and go a little higher. So I might do that. I still haven't decided. It's been finished for a while and I still haven't decided. So as far as the difference in working from the top down on the yoke is just reading the chart upside down and increasing instead of decreasing and knowing or thinking about when to do that. So it worked out fine. I did have to plug in, I kind of did different sizes. I just pretty much knit with the size. I did a gauge swatch and I measured myself, did it a little bit more of like an Elizabeth Zimmerman percentage type sweater so that then I knew how many stitches to do. And because after the yoke, it's pretty much just straight knitting, I didn't have to worry that the numbers weren't exact with what the pattern called for. Now then on the sleeves, because I made a fairly big body size, I didn't want it to be tight. I wanted to be able to wear it over things to go outside, but I didn't want humongous armholes. So I did the sleeves a couple of different times. And, I'd pick up stitches and I'd work a while, try it on, then come back until I got it the way I wanted. And I did just a little over 3/4 length sleeves because I'm always pushing my sleeves up. And I'm glad I did that. And I did I-cord on the edge of the sleeve, on the cuff. So it's not tight. My ribbing is so sloppy and I just like the looks of it. Now then I debated about the bottom, and when I show you close-up pictures, I'll show you of what I should do on the bottom. Should I do ribbing? I didn't have ribbing anywhere else. Should I do an I-cord or just a couple of rows of garter to kind of give that illusion of an I-cord on the bottom? But I have another favorite sweater that I wear that has like that garter welt, I think it's called, where it's like 2 rows knit, 2 rows purl, so you have some ridges. And I really like that. And I thought, this is my comfy, cozy barn sweater, and I don't care if it's not all identical everywhere. And so that's what I did. And actually, it looks pretty good with it because you see those rows of garter, and it looks pretty nice. I'm wearing my sweater earrings that were a gift from my friend Celeste. I thought for this episode, I should wear the sweater earrings. So that's what I did with the tencho. And I really loved the pattern. I'm so glad that Caroline brought it to our attention. And I think I mentioned before that I have another of Beatrice patterns downloaded that I want to make, but I'm knitting some other things right now. And so that'll wait. It's going to happen, but it will wait. And it really wasn't difficult to change over to knitting from the top down, at least for me. Knitting is forgiving. It is what it is. The main color, the main yarn that I used on this has a very special meaning to me as well. It's yarn from a friend, a dear friend, Lucy, who I met in a knitting class, in a sock knitting class. We took 2 at a time toe-up sock class together, didn't know each other, met each other there. We were having fits learning to do that, and she was just a riot. She was an old retired nurse, and she was one of the good old nurses, worked midnights all of her career, and was a knitting fanatic. She also did spinning and weaving, and she raised some sheep, and she had a few sheep that were retirees. They weren't breeding anymore. And I can't remember the names of those ewes. I wished I had written it down. But one was a Border Leicester and one was a Romney, and she had sent yarn off to be made. It's a 2-ply, it's a fairly heavy yarn, and she was in poor health and selling some things. And one of the things was that yarn that she'd had made, also a spinning wheel, which I purchased from her. And the yarn, when I first looked at it, I thought, oh, I don't know, it felt, and I'm not sensitive to wool at all, but it really did feel coarse. But I thought, I'm going to take a chance on it. It was Lucy's. Lucy was my friend. And, I thought, well, I'm going to take it off her hands. It can be outerwear of some kind. Well, as happens, that kind of wool can really blossom when it's washed and worked. And I'm so glad that I did. I'm so glad I have the spinning wheel, because it wasn't long after that she passed away. So I guess that also makes working with that yarn mindful knitting, thoughtful knitting. Anyway, I think of her when I use it. I think of those sheep. I think of that day at her farmhouse that she was packing up because she was moving. And I'm just really glad that I have that. Also, to look at it, when I bought it, look at it in the bag, it looked like a steel gray, or a pewter gray, I guess I would say, not a steel gray. Very gray. And I happened to have it laying near where this apricot color Angora blend yarn was, and it really took on a warm brown cast. And so I tried it together, and I love it. So I love the sweater. I love how the yarn worked up. I want to make more sweaters with it because I have quite a bit. It's special to me. And anyway, that's the story of the yarn for this sweater. From Lucy's retired sheep, from my dear friend who I shared many laughs with and many hours of knitting and spinning time, who's greatly missed. And so I can think about her when I'm wearing this, and some of the laughs. I can hear her laugh even now thinking about it. So that's the story of the yarn, the main yarn for the sweater. And then, of course, the special yarn from someone who's now become a very good friend, Caroline, who we've talked about before. And the Romney and the Border Leicester really bloom too, and gives a nice halo, as does the other. And the Romney and Border Leicester is going to wear like iron. So that's the story of that yarn and the story of this sweater. I can't think of anything else to say about it, except that, again, and it seems like I do this a lot, but I want to thank Caroline again for reminding me to be brave and fearless in my knitting or my spinning, that don't have to follow all the rules, or as another friend, Emily, says, I am the boss of my knitting, that I can do what I want with it. It's going to work or it isn't going to work. It's not the end of the world. So it really made for a joyful knit, and I hated to finish. I enjoyed every bit of it. I really hated to finish, other than I wanted to be finished and done and wearing the sweater. So there's my rambling about that. If you have any questions about it, I'll try to answer them if I can. But it's really a nice pattern and worth checking out. I think you would really enjoy it. So on to our next bit, whatever that might be. I'm going to pause for a minute. My friend Lucy. Now I've got this laid here on the table, so I'm not sure how clearly that will show, but this is what I mean about the hem. A couple rows of purl and knits, and I did a split, then I split a little longer in the back than in the front, and the I-cord on the edge of the sleeves. and no color work on the bottom. Another thing that I wanted to mention in talking about being fearless or brave or the boss of your knitting, the Aranya, if I'm saying that right, quite a bit finer yarn than what the Romney and Border Leicester is, but I did it together anyway. And you know, wool blooms and fills in the gaps, so no problem. But just one of the most favorite things that I have ever made. So there you go. Tencho pullover. Okay, and finally, to end, and I've had to turn the light on. Hope it doesn't make too weird of a yellow glow, but we're really losing the daylight. I wanted to share some of my thoughts about November and December. Listening to a lot of podcasts or reading people's Instagram posts, it surprises me, I guess. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that people get sad about wintertime or holiday time, but how many people really aren't fond of November? And so I was just really sad to hear that, to read about that so many people are. And often they have said that once they're past November and make it to December, they're all right. But November is probably one of my favorite months, November and December both. It's no secret that I love winter, fall too, but winter especially. I think a lot of us that are wool people like those colder months. But for me, I think it has more to do with being a farmer and having such a busy life and so much of my life that's not my own, that involves other people, here for my husband, or just different things. And knowing that with November comes a slower pace, more darkness, and I'm okay with that. I mean, I just look at it as a time to be able to rest a little bit, to slow down a lot. There's still work to do on the farm. There's a lot of work to do on the farm. You guys know how that is. But the rhythm for me is just more natural or easier for me to deal with than the pace of spring and summer and even fall, because in fall you're kind of rushing around. So I cherish November and December. I look forward to them. So I wonder if anybody else does too. And do you think it's the rhythm of the farming that is that? I will say that it was different when I had to drive to an office or to a business to work. Now that I'm able to just work from home, I don't like to drive in bad roads. I don't like to drive in the dark. So maybe that's part of it. I can appreciate it more because when darkness comes, chores are done and supper can be done and it's time to just settle in for the night. So anyway, that's my thought on that. It also happens to be some important people to me have birthdays in November and December, so maybe that. I don't look forward to a holiday rush or the busyness of that, but we don't have to do that much anymore or right now either. So it's just a time for me to pull myself in even more than I guess I already do, and not have to make excuses for being at home, and not have to think at 6 o'clock, if I want to finish supper and we want to call it a night, I don't have to think, oh, there's still 3 hours of daylight. I should be outside mowing the grass or moving a fence or cleaning the barn. I can just have that excuse to stay in the house and do something. So that's how I feel about it. It's a pretty special time. And I'm always, although it's a joyous time, it's always a sad time when that rush moves towards spring and summer. So that's how it is for me. And while I'm sitting here knitting and finishing up the recording, I want to talk about two people that I think so much of who happen to have podcasts. One's a frequent podcaster, one not so much. There's no way I could mention everybody that I enjoy, that I love, that I appreciate for one reason or the other. It's just that these two that I'm about to mention have been on my mind quite a bit lately, so I want to share them with you because maybe you do watch them. You've probably heard me talk about them on Instagram, or because we like the same kind of things. But because time is so limited and resources are precious, and trying to work with things that mean something to me, like the yarn for from Lucy, my friend Lucy, my friend Caroline, or from our own farm yarn. These two people are people who make projects with a meaning, maybe not a purpose, but with a special meaning attached. The yarn, oh, look at my funny clothes. The yarn or the fiber, maybe they got it at a special place or someone was with them for a special reason. But that's such a meaningful thing, and I really enjoy it. And the first is Marley's, who is Double Cat Espresso and the Yarn Brew podcast. Now, I love her podcast because I love coffee and I enjoy cats, and I'll never travel to certain parts of the world, and she lives in beautiful Austria. And she's lived a lot of different places and she travels a lot of places. So, of course, I started watching her podcast, and I adore her sense of humor and her seriousness. I love the history that she appreciates and shares of where she lives and of traditions and of family. I love all of that. And I think her life sounds very interesting. And I wish she had more time to just sit and relax and knit, but she doesn't. But she takes us along on journeys, and quite often they're funny, or she always laughs at funny or at things that happen. She doesn't take herself too seriously. But her projects that she knits and the yarn that she's gathered, curated maybe, I love the stories that she tells about them. She might have stash and some of it might be a few years old, but she can tell you the road she walked and the time of year it was and what it meant and the reason that she bought it, maybe not what she's going to make out of it, but I just love that. And that then she picks projects out afterwards to go with those things. She also has a quite rich knitting history with her mother and grandmother, and she talks about that, and I enjoy that. And she just does really neat things, and she's been doing Vlogmas, and it's one of my favorite ones. So if you don't already follow Marley's on Instagram, she also has a Ravelry group, or if you don't watch her podcast, Yarn Brew Podcast on YouTube, please go check it out because it's just delightful. And I only recently realized that she has a blog that she writes at too. I think she's been redoing it. And she's a beautiful writer as well. So I think she deserves all the followers that she can get and all the encouragement that she can get, because she really has brought a lot of joy and interest to my life and my knitting life with the things that I get to see her do, and the part of world that she lives in, and also the lovely coffee. Well, here, back a while ago, she had a knit along, and I happened to win one of the prizes. So I got a beautiful skein of yarn and a project bag that she made herself that's so adorable. I'll have to show a picture of it. I don't have it right here with me. So I was really tickled about that. And then I wanted to send something to her from our farm because we've, chatted back and forth. And while I was getting that ready to send to her, along came a package in the mail to me. And it was from her. Not as a prize that I'd won, but just as a thank you for being encouraging. And it came at the end of a kind of a rough day, or in the middle of a rough day. It had coffee beans, which is the way to my heart. It had some chocolate from Vienna and a little story about the Christmas Nicholas and Krampus. Am I saying that right? So I enjoyed that. And a beautiful skein of yarn, naturally dyed in that real vintage red color, not a bright neon red or a clear red, just that warm, looks like a faded old flannel shirt or a faded old red long john shirt. And I had been looking for that shade of red in my stash that day and hadn't come across anything. And so it was like it was just meant to be. So I wanted to thank her for that too. And just to mention that. So Marley's, thank you for putting out the content that you put out. Oh, and I wanted to mention that she's having another knit along. And I think she's just recently decided to make it a year-long knit-along. And I'm going to have to put this down in the show notes too. Is it the thoughtful knit-along or the mindful knit-along? I can't remember. I'll put it in for sure. But it's to mean, a knit-along, knitting something that, or crafting something that has a special meaning to you. So we might want to join that too, kind of low key, low pressure, but just to encourage one another in doing that. So I wanted to mention that as well. Now the other one, my other friend that I want to mention that a lot of you know, and she doesn't podcast as often, but it's always a joy when she does, and that's Lori at Chickenwood Studio. And Lori is a delight because she does so many things, but the other thing that really strikes me about her acquisitions and her stash and the things that she spins or knits, and she does weaving too, is that there's almost always a really cool story with it. Whether it's from a trip to Shetland or to a different part of the country. She goes to Maine. She lives in New York. There's just usually some story behind her yarn or what she buys or a pattern she chooses to make. And I really enjoy that. So, plus she's just a neat person. And she was a great encouragement to me when I was starting the podcast. And she was the one who actually made the comment that this location looked like a nice place to podcast from. So thank you for that, Lori. So that's Chickenwood Studio. And she's partnered on a couple of different ventures with Patricia at Knitography. So you may have known her from there. But her podcast is one to check out too. So I just wanted to mention those two this time and share what they've meant to me. So I hope I was talking loud enough. My throat's kind of sore and I'm tired. I probably look it. I have not been sleeping well. I tend to be an insomniac anyway, and I haven't been sleeping a lot. I'm not worried. I'm not sick. I guess I feel the weight of things somewhat right now. And so I know I look a little puffy and pale, but oh well. You're not here to see my beauty because I don't have it. But I realized when I was watching back some earlier recording that my voice is not very strong either. So I need to speak up a little bit. Plus I'm not looking at the camera, I guess. So that's probably a good place to end right now. Knitting away on my test knit. Going to do some more spinning for the Handspun Winter spin along. That's with Emily at Fibertown. And the other bits and pieces I'll string together. Oh, I wanted to say too that I might have said last time. Anyway, I'm shooting for putting out the main podcast around the 15th of the month. And there might be small bits here and there, but that's my goal. And this month especially, everybody's busy with Christmas and Vlogmas and stuff. So, there might be other times where they're more often, but that's what I'm shooting for. So if some of you come looking and haven't seen it, and what you can do if you haven't already is subscribe, hit the subscribe button down below. That way, you'll see when a new podcast comes up or a new video, but also then hit the little bell, which is your notifications. And so that way you'll know if something comes up, if you don't want to miss anything. Maybe you'd rather just watch hit or miss, but if you subscribe and then hit that little bell so that you get notifications when we put up anything new, whether it's a short video or the full podcast. So that should do it for now. By the time I put all the other bits and pieces together. Thank you again to everyone who's followed, who's sent comments, either publicly or privately. Thank you very much. It means very much to me. I try to answer everyone that I get, every message, whether it's here or on Instagram or by email. The encouragement is wonderful. And again, if there's something that you want to see, then just ask me and I'll try to put it on here. Or if you have a question about anything, I'll try to answer. A couple of questions that I've gotten or interest there seems to be in is washing wool. And I probably won't do a video about it, or at least if I do, maybe not till warmer weather, but I'll try to remember and link I have a couple of pages on my blog about washing wool, how I do it, and so I'll link to that down below. And also show notes, such as they are, such as I do them, are going to be over on my blog. It's just a little bit easier to do the links. So if you go into the down bar here, that's where the link to the blog is. And if you go to the blog, that's where the show notes are. And if you follow me on Ravelry, if I'm working on a project, I try to put it in my project page. So check that out too. So connect somehow if you can. I love to hear what you're up to, or if anything resonates with you, or if you think I'm crazy, just say so. So there might be a small video out before the first of the year, but otherwise I'll be on Instagram. You can find me there. And I hope that you're all doing well. And for those of you that don't enjoy November and December, if there's anything that we can do to make a little more light in your day, just let us know, would ya? We'll try to do it. Or send you some good warm thoughts, maybe. So we'll talk soon. Here's hoping that this light isn't too bad, guys. Happy knitting, happy spinning, and take care of yourselves.